the Labour Party for bringing this motion. The Social Democrats will be supporting it. It contains a number of very sensible proposals and measures which we're very happy to support. We would go, on some of these we would go a little bit further, but that's a matter of some detail. I want to say, the fact that the Minister for Housing, of course, hasn't shown up for this very important debate says a lot about his attitude to this housing crisis and this housing disaster that it's in. The fact that we're not surprised that he hasn't shown up shows the way that he's engaged with the Oireachtas since he's become Minister. I asked him, when he did make a rare appearance at the Oireachtas Housing Committee, he had to be there because of the estimates, but he won't come to the committee to provide updates or answer questions. I asked him how much money from this year is unspent and being sent back to the Central Exchequer funds. He wouldn't provide an answer. I submitted a written question on that. He hasn't answered on it. I asked him today in the Dáil about it. He wouldn't answer on that question. Now, thankfully, due to a different department, the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, and a report that they published, we have an estimate on that €241 million from the Department of Housing in 2022 unspent is being returned to Exchequer funds. The Department of Housing and the Minister won't answer us on this, even though I asked him today, is that an accurate figure or not? Wouldn't give an answer. And thanks to the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, we have that estimate, and from the work of the Parliamentary Budget Office as well. I think the Department and the Minister himself should be answering that question. We have a right to know about that. We have a right to accountability on that from the Senior Minister for Housing. What could we have done in 2022 if that €241 million that's been returned to Central Exchequer funds had actually been spent on building housing? If you take it that in terms of affordable purchase, homes can be constructed usually with a subsidy of about €50,000. That means with that €241 million, we could have delivered and provided almost 5,000 affordable purchase homes for people all over this country that are badly needed. Put that in context, if you think of one of the most successful affordable purchase housing schemes in this country, Marino, that was built 100 years ago in my constituency, an incredibly successful community to this day, very cohesive, well planned, well designed. To put that in context of the money being sent back to the Exchequer this year that the Minister failed to spend, that's the equivalent of 4 Marinos being delivered. Now think of the difference that would make in our housing disaster. Think of the difference that would make to the families that would benefit from that, from the families who would no longer be worried about an eviction out of the private rent sector and would be thinking, wouldn't have to be worrying of uprooting their kids from school, their children having to make new friends, having to settle into a new school. Think of the difference that would make if that money had been spent and not returned to Central Exchequer funds. That €241 million doesn't include the €340 million that we do know for certain wasn't spent this year and has been carried over into 2023, that wasn't spent in 2022. What could we have done with that €340 million not spent, carried over into this year? In terms of social homes, when you consider that social homes are delivered by a mix of loans from the Housing Finance Agency and direct capital funding, that could have provided somewhere in the region of about 4,000 social homes. Now, what a difference that would make to people in insecure HAP tenancies, people paying rents in the private rent sector that they can't afford, people living in box rooms, overcrowded conditions, to the people who are in homeless emergency accommodation who could have moved out of that into social housing tenancies. What a difference that €340 million that wasn't spent, that's carried over into this year, could have made and should have made to all those individuals and families, and could have made in terms of taking pressure off the private rent sector and benefiting everyone else who's there. How on earth does this government justify leaving hundreds of millions of euro that should have been spent on housing last year unspent. How? No mention of it, of course, in the government's counter-motion. No mention of it in the government's contribution this evening, self-congratulatory, telling us how great they are. But it's an absolute slap on the face to everybody affected by this housing disaster that money wasn't spent and wasn't invested in building homes that could have removed people from that stress. You would think, Cathaoirleach, from the government's counter-motion, from their comments this evening, and they said, and I quote, "Housing for all is working." Now, how could you say that? We have the highest ever rents in this country ever, the highest ever house prices, the highest ever number of people living in homeless emergency accommodation, the highest ever number of people in their 20s and 30s still stuck in their childhood bedrooms, and we've the highest ever amount left unspent by any government that was allocated for housing. There are 5 appalling records on housing, and yet you tell us the Housing for All is working. How? The government narrative, and we hear this continuously, we heard it from the Taoiseach before Christmas, and we heard it from him yesterday, keeps saying, look, there's a housing problem everywhere. Grass isn't greener if you go elsewhere. Even yesterday he was saying there's a problem all over Europe. This is the classic deflection. Yes, there is a housing problem in other countries, but to suggest that it's as bad as here simply is not true. Not only are rents more expensive in Dublin than any other capital city in the European Union, data published by Eurostat shows that the highest rent increases relative to house prices over the past 12 years of anywhere in the European Union has been in Ireland. So this narrative that we've a problem everywhere and it's simply Ireland is the same, just not true. What needs to be done, Cathaoirleach, I have to say the answer is staring us in the face in terms of what needs to be done. You walk out of here into neighbourhoods and communities that were built successfully in terms of public housing close by to here in decades gone. The answer is clear in terms of what could be done in terms of building social housing and affordable purchase housing. I just want to take up one final point in terms of the government's response here, and the counter-motion tells us there will be a commission comprehensive review of the private rent sector. Now, how is it 2.5 years into office and all the difficulties we have in the private rent sector that the government are only telling us now they're going to comprehensively look at this? Where is the action?